In my last video, I argued that Austria-Hungary didn't collapse simply because of ethnic diversity, as the more mainstream narrative tends to suggest. Instead, I explained how, in my opinion, by 1918, the monarchy was facing a perfect storm from multiple directions. There was economic collapse, military defeat, external pressure from the Allied powers who did want to break up the empire, in addition to the rise of both socialist and nationalist movements that were challenging the system simultaneously, all at once from both the inside and the outside. Today, there's something I want to elaborate on from that discussion which I feel is incredibly important. I want to discuss the evolution of nationalism and socialism in Austria-Hungary. While most socialist movements remained internationalist and most nationalist movements focused on ethnic autonomy, there were some key exceptions. Many times we speak broadly of nationalist or socialist movements, but I find that historians miss something critical. Austria-Hungary was a uniquely fertile political soil where socialism and nationalism stopped being separate parallel forces and merged into completely new political experiments that would define the face of the 20th century. During the time of Austria-Hungary, these were minority movements within their broader respective political camps, but they would prove extremely historically significant after the collapse of the empire. The key point I wish to make in this video is that Austria-Hungary was the birthplace of the ideology of National Socialism. Now, before we jump in, I would like to say that this video will be a bit challenging for me because I'll need to explain quite complex political ideas, beginning with socialism itself. I'm also sort of walking into the lion's den, trying to untangle a massive and controversial historical knot. So I ask you to bear with me, because before we get directly into the topic at hand, I do need to cover some theoretical ground with you so that we're all on the same page. First, we need to understand what socialism actually means, because it's not just Marxism like many people think, though that has become the most familiar version. Socialism at its core is about collective ownership or control of the means of production, and organizing society around the needs of the community rather than individual profit. But there are many different ways to achieve this and different versions. Marxism represents one popular approach. It is international, class-based, and revolutionary. But there were other socialist traditions developing simultaneously alongside it. Some groups would break away from the communists and begin to emphasize more gradual reform rather than violent revolution, such as the Social Democrats. During the First World War, other groups would also splinter from the Social Democrats to oppose their support of the war, such as the Independent Socialists in Germany. We don't need to get into the entire history of socialism in this video, but the point is that socialism has always been diverse. There is not just one doctrine. And with that, we need to understand nationalism as well. This requires understanding how revolutionary the idea actually was for its time. For most of human history, the concept of the nation as we understand it today simply didn't exist. People identified with their village, their religion, their lord, their king, or their family. To give an example, a peasant in Bavaria felt no special kinship with a merchant in Hamburg just because they both spoke German dialects. Nationalism as we know it today emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as part of what historians call Romantic nationalism. This was the radical idea that people who shared common characteristics like language, culture, ethnicity, or historical experience formed a natural political community that should govern itself. What Romantic nationalists argued was that each nation had its own unique spirit, and it could only flourish under its own self-rule. This was revolutionary for its time because it suggested that a German-speaking farmer in Prussia had more in common with a German-speaking professor in Bavaria than with his French-speaking neighbor. It claimed that political borders should match cultural and linguistic ones. Now, throughout the 19th century, nationalism and socialism were seen as competing forces. Nationalists focused on ethnic or cultural identity, your shared history and language. It said your primary loyalty should be to your nation, your people, your shared history and language. Socialism focused on economic class. It said your primary loyalty should be to your fellow workers, regardless of what country they came from. A German worker, according to socialist theory, had more in common with a French worker than with a German factory owner. This created a fundamental tension. Socialists believed that nationalism was a distraction used by the ruling classes to divide workers who should be united. Nationalists believed that socialism ignored the deep cultural bonds that made people who they were. Most political movements chose one side or the other. You were either a nationalist party focused on ethnic interests or a socialist party focused on class struggle. But all over Europe, when national feeling was running high, and perhaps even more so in Austria-Hungary, where ethnic divisions were more pronounced, some began to ask, what if nationalism and socialism could work together instead of against each other? Crucially for our story, some began to argue that socialism needed to be rooted in national identity rather than international class solidarity. These became known as social nationalists or national socialists. This is where the history of Austria-Hungary becomes essential. The empire's unique political pressures created the perfect laboratory for these ideological experiments and ideas to develop. Now, when I say the name National Socialist, you do probably correctly think of Hitler and the National Socialists in Germany. But they were not the originators of the ideology. I would like to start our story today with the first National Socialist Party that came into existence, which was the Czech National Socialists. Czech politicians in Austria-Hungary founded what they called the National Social Party, later renamed the Czechoslovak National Socialist Party, in an effort to systematically combine two competing streams of thought in 1897. Right at the heart of the Habsburg Empire. It was based on a sophisticated theoretical framework. Based on my analysis of their founding documents, I'll outline their key ideas, though their full political philosophy was far more nuanced than I can cover here. The roots go back to Jan Hus and the Hussite movement of the 15th century. This wasn't just religious reform, it was the first successful fusion of social justice and national identity in European history. Hus would preach in Czech to crowds of 3,000, translate scripture into his mother language, and explicitly argued that the Czech people should become masters in their own country, opposing both the German-speaking Catholic bishops and the Holy Roman Emperor directly. Of course, this was not popular with the ruling elite of his time. Hus was burned in 1415, and it triggered something unprecedented, the Hussite Wars, where Czech speakers united under both religious and national banners against German Catholic authority. By 1434, they had forced the Catholic Church to negotiate the Basel Compacts, essentially winning themselves religious autonomy through successful political resistance. Within a century, 90% of the Czech lands were Hussite. This created a crucial political template. In Czech thinking, nationalism meant democratic liberation from foreign German Catholic rule. Social reform and national identity were not competing forces. They were one part of the same struggle. So why is all of this so important? In essence, the party modeled itself after the tradition of the Hussite movement and emerged because some felt that existing political options were not addressing their reality. The Czech Social Democrats were internationalists. They wanted Czech workers to unite with German and Hungarian workers based on the principle of class solidarity. This movement was powerful, and arguably they were having some success. As I mentioned in my last video, the Austrian and Czech Social Democrats successfully implemented Czech as an administrative language in 1880. But some Czech politicians argued that this ignored a fundamental truth about their situation. As they put in their key theoretical statement, the Czech question is simultaneously a social question. But what did they mean by this? Their core argument was that you cannot separate Czech national aspirations from economic issues, because in their view, Czech workers faced a double exploitation in the monarchy. They were being exploited as workers, yes, but they were also being exploited specifically as ethnic Czechs all the same by German-speaking factory owners, by a political system that privileged other nationalities, and by economic policies that kept Czech regions underdeveloped. It was one and the same thing to them. Now, I'm not stating this as fact or my opinion, I just wish to represent their opinions accurately. The idea behind their party program was explicit. The party would bring together politically active members of Czech society who were seeking ways to combine social reform with active participation in national life, marrying the Czech socialists and the Czech nationalists in one wedding. For our story, here's what's crucial to understand. Their version of National Socialism was explicitly democratic and reformist. This wasn't revolutionary violent Marxism, neither reformist social democracy. It was something new, a socialism that worked through democratic institutions, that emphasized gradual reform, and that was rooted in Czech national identity rather than international class solidarity. But they were a minority. The approach they were taking put them at odds with everyone. First, there were the Old Czechs, led by František Palacký and later František Ladislav Rieger. These were die-hard Austro-Slavists who wanted to reform the Habsburg Empire by giving Slavic peoples more autonomy within the existing system and federalizing it. Their point was that Czech aspirations could be satisfied through imperial restructuring rather than full-blown independence. They did not wish to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Second, there were the newer, more radical Czech nationalists, the Young Czechs, who thought the National Socialists were too focused on economic issues. Why muddy pure patriotism with talk about workers and social reform? It was just a form of dilution. Third, there were the more Marxist-leaning Social Democrats who believed that Czech workers should unite with German, Hungarian, and other workers across the empire based on class. They saw all the focus on national identity as a bourgeois obstacle to real change that was just dividing the workers for the ruling elite. But the Czech National Socialists rejected all three paths. Against the old guard of the Austro-Slavists, they believed that the Habsburg system was fundamentally unreformable. Against the Young Czechs, they argued that you just couldn't separate national liberation from social issues. And finally, against the Social Democrats, they insisted that Czech workers had more in common with other Czechs than with foreign workers from across the empire. So in essence, a social democratic program, but through the lens of ethnic nationalism. And crucially, they rejected the Marxist idea of inevitable class conflict. Instead, they argued that within the Czech nation, different classes could and should cooperate. But there is something important to understand how all this Czech identity evolved. Originally, the party was explicitly Czech, focused on Czech speakers and the Czech lands. But as they gained political experience, they realized the demographic reality. The historic Czech lands contained millions of German speakers. For 1,000 years, it had been part of the German Federation and the Holy Roman Empire. A purely Czech state wouldn't be practically viable. And so they had to adapt pragmatically. The leaders of the movement began promoting a larger Czechoslovak identity that could include Slovaks, Ruthenians, and even Germans and Hungarians who were willing to assimilate culturally. They needed a larger population base to create a viable nation-state that could compete with German Austria and Hungary so that it could be secure. But notice that we've now departed from a strictly Czech ethnic form of nationalism. We're now talking about something a little bit broader, that goes beyond strict ethnic or economic lines. It began to encompass many different groups. Strictly speaking, and in my own opinion, of course I do have the benefit of hindsight, I believe that they felt forced to take this approach. This was a completely new way of thinking about both socialism and nationalism. With time, the party would become a major force in Czech politics, the dominant party, and it later played a key role in founding and governing Czechoslovakia in the post-war world. So, we've now covered the Czechs, but this was not the only version of National Socialism emerging from Austria-Hungary. At the same time, in the German-speaking regions of Bohemia, a very different synthesis was taking shape. It was one that would prove far more radical and ultimately more historically significant. This brings us to Rudolf Jung and the Germans in Czechia. Jung was one of 3 million Germans living in the Czech lands, originally working in the railroads. Like the Czechs, the Germans in Czechia felt caught between competing pressures. Before the war, they were in Austria-Hungary, but increasingly dominated by Czech political power as the empire democratized. Jung's political approach put him at odds with the existing German political options in Austria-Hungary. First, there were the Pan-Germans under Georg von Schönau, who focused on German ethnic unity but had little interest in economic reform or workers' issues. They wanted to unite all Germans under one flag but offered no solutions for the economic exploitation that Jung felt around him. Second, and as we've already discussed, there were the German Social Democrats, who wanted German workers to unite with their Czech and Hungarian and other counterparts based on international class solidarity. Like the Czechs, they saw national identity as a distraction from the real struggle between capital and labor. Third, there were the German Christian Socialists under Karl Lueger, who combined German nationalism with Catholic social teaching, but Jung saw their approach as too tied to the old imperial system and too influenced by religious hierarchy. Jung rejected all three paths. Against the Pan-Germans, he argued you couldn't separate national identity from economic issues. Against the Social Democrats, he insisted that German workers had more in common with German employers than with foreign workers. And against the Christian Socialists, he believed the solution lay in racial rather than religious unity. I don't know to what extent his approach fundamentally followed from the Czech National Socialists. A lot of core pieces do feel similar, but yet distinct. Jung was developing a more radical socialist and nationalist project, which would become a more comprehensive and extreme worldview. He would write, "In economic life there are only two major groups, which stand in opposition to one another. The one which performs productive work, and the other which receives unearned income." He argued that modern capitalism had created two separate, distinct classes: those who worked with their hands or minds to create value, and those who lived off of what he called unearned income, rent from land ownership, interest from money lending, and profits from speculation. But Jung went further than just economic reform. He explicitly connected these economic ideas to German racial identity and anti-Semitism. For Jung, the parasitic class wasn't just an economic category, but it was a distinct racial one. He argued that certain groups, particularly Jews, were inherently predisposed to this kind of unproductive, exploitative behavior, and it takes up large parts of his writing and theories. The anti-Semitism itself was certainly not unique to his movement. To give an example, Czech nationalism too carried with it centuries of complex, often hostile relationships with both German authority and Jewish populations. To briefly illustrate, during the notorious riots of 1897, Czech and German nationalists attacked Jewish shops and synagogues for almost 3 days. In the earlier years, we do see a recurring pattern. Czech and German nationalists, enemies on everything else, were actively working together and almost united in their anti-Semitic beliefs. But this had stopped being the case. The Czech National Socialist camp began to advocate for a far more moderated stance on this sort of violence, and by the time it gained any real power, it no longer carried any racial or anti-Semitic tones at all, instead trying to actively incorporate different, even opposing social groups for the pragmatic reasons I explained. But this raises a crucial question. Why did Czech and German National Socialism diverge so dramatically when both emerged from the same imperial pressures? The answer likely lies in the Hussite legacy that we discussed earlier, but also in how these two movements experienced completely different relationships to power. The Czech and German versions learned opposite lessons from the same historical experiences. It's important to understand that these were not isolated groups. They were neighbors, co-workers, often friends, living in the same towns, working in the same factories, yet experiencing the same political changes in completely opposite ways. For hundreds of years, Germans and Czechs had coexisted peacefully in the same territories, sharing economic and cultural life. Yet these two camps were now developing ideologies that would make them mortal enemies. For the Czech National Socialist camp, the model was always Jan Hus himself. Combine social reform with national identity, work through democratic institutions, and gradually liberate your people from foreign domination. And note that this wasn't really naive. The approach had worked for the Hussites, and by 1918 too, the Czechs had achieved their own independent state. Success through democratic means reduced the appeal of radical solutions. But for the Germans, like Jung in Bohemia, the situation was reversed. They weren't an oppressed minority seeking liberation, they were the formerly dominant group losing privilege to a Czech majority. The other in Czech political thinking had been the German Catholic Habsburg system, but the other in Jung's thinking became both the Catholic Church and the newly empowered Czechs. So yes, it was the same ideological language and foundation, but completely opposite historical forces, and as a result of that, directions. One path led to parliamentary democracy, and the other to a more radical view of racial ideas and what would become the notorious National Socialist regime in Germany. And this is the crucial distinction. Unlike the Czechs, Jung's solution was to explain economic exploitation through racial categories. In Jung's eyes, German workers weren't just being exploited by capitalists alone, they were being exploited by racially foreign elements who couldn't engage in honest, productive labor. This gave his movement a completely different character from that of the Czech National Socialists. When Austria-Hungary fell apart, Jung found himself in a devastating personal situation. He was now in the new Czechoslovakia, but he was lost. His German Workers' Party at this point was renamed the German National Socialist Workers' Party. This personal displacement, losing his position, his country, and his status, helps perhaps also explain why his version of the ideology became far more radical and resentful than the Czech model. All of this history is so important to understand because it would be Jung who would directly inspire, with his ideas, key thinkers who would later go on to build one of the most notorious and radical regimes of the 20th century. It was his work that laid out ideas which would become familiar. The concept of productive versus parasitic labor, the focus on eliminating unearned income, and the connection between economic exploitation and racial identity. So I wish to make this crucial point that few understand. The combining of nationalism and socialism flowed from Austria-Hungary to Germany, not the other way around. Both Jung's theoretical framework and the Czech movement which we spoke about, although completely different in practice, were developed in response to the same Habsburg imperial pressures. They both ended up developing their own unique synthesis of nationalism and socialism to address the different social and political pressures that they faced within the same Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the story doesn't end there. The ideological seeds that were scattered from Austria-Hungary reached even further than we might initially imagine. And this brings us to an uncomfortable historical connection that demonstrates just how far these ideas actually spread. In 1913, a young Italian socialist named Benito Mussolini, yes, the future fascist dictator, but at this point still a committed communist, wrote a biography of Jan Hus. It would be called Giovanni Hus il Veridico, Jan Hus, the truth teller. The laboratory of ideas coming out of Austria-Hungary were influencing socialist movements across Europe. During this period, he even used the pen name Vero Eretico, the sincere heretic, modeling himself after the reformer. For Mussolini, Hus wasn't just a historical figure, he was his idol, his ideal model of leadership, someone who could take hold over the masses of people, guiding and defending them through a combination of social reform and national identity. Now, to be completely clear, this does not make Hus or Czech history responsible at all for what Mussolini would become. Ideas take on lives of their own as they spread. The point is that Mussolini, originally a member of the Communist Party of Italy, would go on to synthesize his own version of nationalism and socialism too, which would go on to become the fascist movement. If you've watched this far into the video, well, first of all, I sort of applaud you, it's a long video, but the reason why it had to be so long was to show why Austria-Hungary matters so much to understand the origins of these ideologies. The empire's unique conditions with ethnic competition, economic modernization, democratic reforms, external pressure to break apart, it all created an ideological laboratory unlike anywhere else in Europe. It produced two completely different experiments in fusing nationalism and socialism. Both emerged from the same imperial pressures, but they evolved in fundamentally different directions. They carried the same name, they came from the same place, but yet they are to each other almost polar opposites. When Austria-Hungary collapsed, both versions of National Socialism survived and spread. The Czech path, following centuries of Hussite democratic tradition, led to a parliamentary democracy in Czechoslovakia, with its own dozens of contradictions not too dissimilar from that of Austria-Hungary herself. Jung's path, born more from his own displacement and resentment, provided the radical and revolutionary theoretical framework for what would later become the Nazi Party. Both would erode the peaceful coexistence between Czech and German speakers that had existed for centuries in the Czech lands. Shared communities were now replaced with mutual suspicion, and history would go on to test them both in 1938, when the heirs of the Czech movement faced the heirs of Jung across the Sudetenland. Hi everyone, thanks so much for watching. I just want to take a moment, as I do at the end of each video, to say how incredibly grateful I am for your amazing support. I try to read as many of your comments as I can, and they often do make my mornings and my days. I also wanted to share something exciting. In my spare time, I've been developing The Infanterist. It's a completely free-to-play, browser-based strategy game. If you'd like to learn more, stay updated, or connect with our growing community, you can join the Discord using the link below. We play video games, chat, suggest video ideas, and to be honest, it's just awesome to meet you and talk to you directly as well. So once again, thanks so much for watching, and as always, stay curious about history.